find out soon enough. Around me, the metal of the ship creaked and groaned familiarly as I made my way toward the stairs at the front of the ship. The walls on either side of me showed the jagged marks of years of repairs and reconfigurations, and I ran my finger over one of the many thick welts of metal as I walked. Exactly like scars, I thought. Scars that showed battle after battle that the Atlas had fought and won. Scars that showed the evidence of its transformations over the years from luxury to lean efficiency. I liked scars. Scars proved you'd survived. I finally reached the stairs and started making my way up, flight by flight, toward the deck. The chilly damp of the lower levels seemed to stay with me, though, and I hurried my pace, hoping that the exercise would warm me up a bit. My legs were burning by the time I finally reached the top deck and walked out into the early morning air of the Mediterranean. I'd asked my dad once why we still labeled sections of the ocean by their original names. It didn't seem to make much sense now that the world was covered by one massive body of water, but he'd told me not to ask such silly questions. That was where he and I disagreed, though. I didn't think any questions were silly, not when it came to the ocean. I took a deep breath, letting the salty freshness scrub away the musty staleness of the inside of the ship, and headed toward the stern. The ship was practically deserted this early, but I still kept my head down as I made my way across the worn deck, passing the large chicken coop where the ship's fleet of hens snoozed safely in their nests. They were some of the only domestic animals that had survived the tide rising. Animals like cows and sheep required grass to survive, and we didn't have any of that anymore. However, it turned out that chickens could thrive on fish guts and the occasional cockroach, and because of that, we had eggs and the rare piece of chicken in our soup. It was a luxury we didn't take for granted. During the day, the hens would peck around, roosting on top of the large storage crates that peppered the deck. Although, unless you really looked, the crates themselves were almost unrecognizable since every square inch of available surface had a gardening box attached to it. It wasn't much, not like on a grower ship, but the herbs and vegetables we were able to cultivate on deck did help supplement our diet of fish, and more fish. The layout was a far cry from the original deck design, but it worked. Once upon a time, the Atlas had been a small cruise ship used for vacations, and if you looked closely, you could still see where there used to be frivolous luxuries like a swimming pool and a running track. The very idea of wasting so much space was laughable now, but I liked to imagine what life was like before, when people sailed on the ocean for fun, and not because it was the only way to survive. We were on the move after having been anchored for 2 days, and above me on the huge masts, the sails were filled with a breeze that moved the massive ship. They seemed disproportionate and out of step with the rest of the ship, for good reason. They had been an afterthought. When the tide had started rising, cruise ships were uniquely suited to take on large groups of people, but they weren't designed to run without fossil fuels. Fuels that would be hard, if not impossible, to come by once the water level rose. So the ship's architects had scrambled to put together a system of sails and rigging that would allow the Atlas to maneuver itself using the wind instead of the engines, which would eventually be scrapped and melted down. A lot of things had needed to be altered or reverted to earlier, less wasteful forms of technology in order to navigate this new, water-filled world. It had been a bit painful for the human race to take a giant step backward. They'd had to give up so many of the resources, technologies, and conveniences that they'd fought for, and rediscover methods of survival carved out by their ancestors. But when your choices are life and death, the decision becomes a lot easier. I made it to the rail of the ship and glanced around for Garth. He was nowhere to be seen, so I leaned against the rail and watched the horizon, where the faintest line of pink and orange was just beginning to glow. I loved sunrise. I loved sunset, too, but I was usually working or eating when that happened. Sunrise, though, that was mine. She and I had a thing, a standing appointment, you could say, and I mentally forgave Wallace for waking me up early. The few extra minutes of quiet, especially on board a ship that was usually anything but, were a treat. The blaze on the horizon brightened.